Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutwith.com. I am Vinay Koshi, and you, more importantly, are a business owner or executive that is passionate about growing your business predictably through empathetic content and conversations, which is why I interview experts and founders like our guest today, Gail Gibson and Kavita Satwalekar, to uncover an aspect of how they go about creating predictable business within their own companies or in that of others. This is part two of a conversation with Kavita and Gail, and we were talking about the rise of the C19 leadership. Gail and Kavita, I think we got about halfway through the 8 pillars that you have set out in your book. And Gail, if memory serves me correctly, we were talking about the 4th pillar, being able to adapt quickly. And you gave the example of a British engineering firm where they adapted pretty quickly to the pandemic situation and being able to work remotely, in that the director and his wife took the time and the effort to check in with each of their staff, make sure they were doing okay on a regular basis and responded to their needs accordingly. And that really helped bring the team together. They were able to grow their business in spite of the pandemic, and as a result hired 2 new staff, if I got the details correctly. But it got me thinking, because you talked about this with this specific example, that they were quite empathetic to their staff. And you mentioned that you had noticed this trend before the pandemic. That it was a trait that they possessed. And it got me thinking, in that, as those of us who are looking to others, perhaps well-known examples, for lessons to learn, would there be value in looking at the story before the start of their success? And I asked that because in my own personal observations, there are lessons to be learned or trends to be picked up on that are indicative of their potential for success later on. And I'm not sure if that makes sense. So perhaps I can use the example of Jeff Bezos and before he started Amazon. Once he finished college, he took up a job with Fitel, which was a fintech telecommunications firm, a startup, and he was tasked with building a network for international trade. He was then promoted to head of business development, and then later on director of customer service. He then moved on from there into the banking industry and started working for a number of hedge funds. And in particular, there was this emphasis on mathematical modeling before he went off to start, I should say, Amazon. And if you look at his career prior to Amazon, you can almost see the skills and the abilities to bring together a lot of perspectives and talents and skills, if you will, to create Amazon to what it is today. And yeah, I'm curious, would you say there's something to be said in looking at people's past, not just in being able to understand whether they can adapt quickly, but also understanding their strengths in order to position them for better success in the future?
I think that's a fantastic question. And if I use the same example of my client, because I've been working with them since 2015, so pre the COVID experience, when I first engaged with them as an organisation, I could see already that they were clearly very empathetic people. So having started as a one-man band over 20 years ago in the UK, it was the director's outlook always to put his people first. So he used his experience that he'd come up through the ranks with the engineering background that he had. And so he wanted to grow a business. So to go from 1 to 10, there has to be something in you to say, I want to engage with people, I want to develop people, and I want to grow my business to achieve success. So what I very quickly noticed from working with him and his wife was that the people that they had in their organization, they always put them first. So everything to do with customer service, with the development of the business, the growth of the business, all came down to this really strong trait of empathy. So I think that in in building that as a strength enabled him and his wife to win through any of those challenges that other organizations often have, because they had that very clear mindset right from the start to say, whoever comes on board with us, we want them to be part of our community. We want them to be feeling that they're valued and belong to our organization. And I think that was the real success of the whole organization. And having worked with them now for 6 years and watched the growth and then watched them go through and supported them through the pandemic as well. Last week alone, I was welcomed to receive yet another email from them. They've just taken on another 2 staff in the organization. So they've got 2 more engineers. Right. So again, it's this exponential growth that they're going through. But to do that and to enable it to continue as a consistent part of growth is they really focus on putting their people first and then checking in with them and then continuing to build these people as they come on board. So to me, that has been such a huge part of their success and will continue to be so going forward.
And I'm curious, some people may be better prone to adapting quickly. For those of us that are stuck in the weeds with this idea of having systems and processes and predictability in our daily lives, then, does it make sense to be aware of that and ensure that you have people around you that would allow for that degree of spontaneity and adaptability that's required in certain situations?
Do you want to take this, Kavita? You're nodding away.
Sure. Absolutely. At the end of the day, adaptability in the workplace, at least, can be a learned behavior. And if it takes a little longer for the people who are making the decisions to get to that stage for themselves, then definitely surround themselves with people who they trust, people whose opinions they value, but to ensure that those people are more agile in their mindsets. Because at the end of the day, leadership starts with self-leadership. So you have to understand yourself, you have to understand your patterns, you have to know your shortfalls. And then once you know that, you can surround yourself with people who can complement it and help you still move in the direction you want to get to.
So having a team around you is important, but that also involves having a degree of empathy to understand where people are coming from, as opposed to getting stuck in your personal frameworks, which I think leads to your 5th pillar, listening deeply.
Absolutely. One of my favorite ones. This whole concept of listening deeply. So the chapter title is, or the 5th pillar is, listen deeply and be inclusively empathetic. So it builds on to a lot of what Gail was explaining from the previous pillar as well. And I say this is my favorite chapter because I think I might have been about 7 or 8 years old when I was always so eager to respond to any questions, whether it be in a classroom, whether it be at home. It may have come from that, I guess, third child syndrome, where I never really got a chance to speak unless I was overly aggressive about it. But at some point, someone told me, you need to listen to be able to hear, not to be able to respond. And somehow that has always stuck with me. And through the years and through the psychology courses and through the organizational behavior courses, I have always heard different versions of this, but it basically boils down to the same thing. Most of us listen for the sake of responding. So before the person has clearly expressed what it is that they want to even say, we have an answer formulated in our heads. But a lot of what coaching tells us, a lot of what anything else tells us about listening deeply, is that you have to listen to the entire issue, the entire concern, let it sit, understand it completely, and then respond. You can't have pre-formulated questions. You can't have pre-formulated agendas or opinions. Yes, people go into conversations with those, but the whole point of this particular pillar is that you're taking that time to listen to what is said in between the lines, to pay attention to what the person standing across from you is not saying. And it's almost like you're building in the leader an aspect of coaching or an aspect of a coach and getting them to be a coach for their teams. So
Right.
that's what, in a nutshell, this particular pillar revolves around.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's often easier said than done, because
Absolutely.
it's probably something that most of us have to unlearn before we can begin to learn to listen deeply. How would you recommend we go about that?
So this is why people like Gail and I are here. Constantly help you understand that even deeper and understand that you're doing it. But most often the people who do it, who aren't really listening, just don't know any better. So it's about first understanding that you might be doing it and then starting to practice it. And so there are a couple of activities. There's one that I've used quite often, and it's about talking to someone about any topic, right? So you pick a partner, have a conversation with them, have them maybe give you details about their life that you didn't know before. And your role is only purely to listen. At the end of the conversation, you reiterate and tell them back everything you heard and have them rate you on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how much you recalled correctly. So that will right there tell you whether you've had your own biases, your own previous experiences that has helped you interpret the information slightly differently even and absorb it, versus if you're just listening for the sake of listening so that you can just share it back. That's an activity that works really well, actually.
Would you say, though, that to really listen deeply, not only should you be ensuring that you're hearing what the person is trying to say to you, but also asking clarifying questions in order to understand the context and perhaps the mental framework from which they're coming from?
Absolutely. And so the activity I gave you was one just for you to understand yourself, right? So to pay attention to how you're interpreting information just when it's said out to you. But absolutely, this is where the coaching conversations come in, right? Where the leader needs to behave like a coach, ask those clarifying questions, and listen really deeply, pay attention to what's going on, and be fully present in the moment when you're having that conversation. So these are all aspects of, again, listening deeply.
So if I'm hearing this correctly, it's not just about ensuring that you understand the information correctly, but to also understand the story of the person that is perhaps unsaid in your meeting, but at least having that desire to discover it in order to better understand them as an individual and the context from which they're able to respond, which I can then see leads into things like being able to adapt quickly and ensure that you're having a real and meaningful conversation as well.
Absolutely. And it also helps you as you go further down. Pillar 7 talks about keeping it real. It ties into some of those pillars as well, because once you the exact context of where this person is coming from, in concepts like goal setting, you can help keep it real. For example, if someone is working from home, their situation might be very different than yours. And we talk about it in one of the chapters with Jeff, where Jeff is single and he has only himself to worry about at home, versus his boss, on the other hand, has a family. And he gets on a conference call before the meeting actually starts with the boss. And he notices that there are children in the background, there are dogs barking, there is bells ringing, and he's got to silence all of that so he can fully focus. Now, before this thing happened for Jeff, he just thought everyone working from home was, in a way, able to give themselves that space and time to fully focus. But here he's seeing his own leader not being able to focus or having to push aside some of these noises before being able to focus. And it opened up a whole new reality.
So where do we go from there? I believe your 6th pillar is around shifting the hierarchy.
It is.
Go for it, Gail.
Okay, so the shifting the hierarchy, what we have seen from our coaching experience, and as Kavita said, all of what we've talked about so far, they merge into the next pillar. So it is about the whole 8 pillars are all about collaboration. And so this next one is more about, historically, organisations have been very siloed in their approach. So they may have all had individual agendas, and through that process of working, or it was also top down. So what has happened in organisations that have succeeded through the crisis that we have seen is that There's no longer top to bottom or bottom to top, but it's about talking to your people. So it's about deeply listening. It's about having those curious conversations so you can understand exactly what is going on. You can understand how people are feeling about different situations. And as a result of that, by having those curious questions and digging even deeper and listening inclusively, is that it's no longer just about the process of organizations. For a long time, organizations got caught up in, if we do this and we implement this process and we stick to it and we measure these targets and we see what the outcomes are, it was very robotic in approach. And so people were expecting results to go up to the top and saying, this isn't happening and that's not happening. When we remove all of that noise from behind and we actually look at the people that are making up the organization and we listen to what's actually going on within different teams and cross-purposing that and bringing people together so that they can collaborate better on projects, then we remove those silos, it's almost like we remove any of those barriers to actually be at your best, to share openly and with confidence, and also to arrive at solutions together. And so when we've seen this happen and this transformation take place, there's a lot more engagement in the teams because they feel valued and heard. And what's happening is the results are exponentially growing. There's higher performing teams, and the organization as a whole, even the CEOs and the people at the top and the senior management team, they're seeing better results amongst their people because they're listening to them and they're allowing them to make some of the decisions. So if I think back to years gone by, and I worked for an organisation in the UK where we weren't given the opportunity, we were silo-led from top down. And so the organisation, our CEO would make the decisions and tell us what to do. So there was resentment, there wasn't the engagement, there was unhappy. We were a very unhappy management team at that stage, because if we came back with solutions to whatever process or whatever was on the table at that time, it was very quickly either pushed away because it wasn't his idea, or it was taken as his idea and then he would tell the whole company that he had come up with this wonderful solution. So we as a management team would be sitting there in public meetings with the whole organization thinking, okay, this is where we have to keep our mouths shut. So it was a very detracting and demotivating way to be led in silos. And so going through the work that Kavita and I now do together and solely, is we're seeing this emergence and seeing how powerful this getting rid of these hierarchies and shifting it toward more collaborative organizations is producing such incredible results.
Could you give us an example of an organization that perhaps you from your experience, that has made that shift?
Can I just pass that one on to you, Kavita? I'm just thinking, just letting me reflect on organisations. I've done so much work with individuals lately through this crisis, not with another organisation other than mine in the UK. So, Kavita, have you got a living example to share?
Well, an organization having made the shift, in my experience right now, doesn't exist. But teams making the shift does exist. It'll take time overall, unless it's coming top down. The experience is that it happens within a team, it's replicated in another team, it's replicated in a third team. Most often it happens at a team, at a slightly senior, mid to senior level. Then it goes down further into their teams. So technically goes down further their own silo within the department. But often enough, it also happens where if it's the marketing department that's doing this, then soon the sales department will start doing it too. And they mimic, and over time, it bubbles up to top management and they can embrace it as well. But in my experience so far, it's only been within teams in a company. And when the shift happens, one of the first things that the leaders notice is this increase in loyalty and the increase in the amount of effort and the kind of work that people put forward. Because everyone now has some sort of skin in the game, because they're being motivated by using, when their ideas are picked and brought to the forefront, it's a form of motivation. You're showcasing other employees within the team. And it just leads to this very strong sense of empowerment and a very collaborative work culture.
You're suggesting that an organization shouldn't make this wholesale change all of a sudden, but rather allow for that to permeate across the organization over a gradual process?
What I'm saying is that it's more organic when it happens the other way.
Okay.
But if the need of the hour, like it is right now, is to then make that shift overnight, some companies may be able to do it. It really depends. But my fear is if people and companies make that change overnight, it's not going to be sustainable, because it's a learned behavior. It's taken them so many years to become who they are currently. So if they make that drastic shift overnight, chances are it won't last.
If I understand this correctly, it really ties back to the culture of the organization.
Absolutely.
And leadership driving the change in culture, if you will. Okay.
Absolutely. Often enough, when I have spoken with leaders at the C-suite level, everyone says, I am doing really well. My direct team is doing really well. It's everything below that's a little bit messed up, right? Now, what ends up happening in a situation like that is they want the teams below their direct levels to start then working on leadership training, not realizing that the biggest gap is between their direct reports and the team below them. So that is where that cultural change, once it starts happening at that level, that's when it can permeate very quickly within the company.
Is there anything else that we need to be aware of in terms of shifting the hierarchy within the organization?
I think with this one as well, it's a big mindset change.
Right.
And the leaders need to see value in doing things differently. So that whole sense of a leader being comfortable in their own skin and not feeling threatened by ideas that come up from within their team members, that aspect of it is very important. So that whole concept of trust building, the whole concept of I've got your back, all of those things play a very important, a very vital role, which oftentimes gets overlooked. So that's pretty much the basis to then moving forward and enabling a shift like that.
I think it's about letting go as well, isn't it, Kavita, and the delegation, because for some leaders pre-COVID and as well, they were ones who held tightly to everything that was going on in the organization because they felt it was their responsibility. And so by holding lightly to this change, because that's what has to happen, is allowing yourself to be able to let go so that it does filter down through the organization and people feel comfortable. They feel, as Kavita said, empowered to actually stand up and be given that delegated position to say, you can take this forward, you can discuss this with your team, and let's see what the outcome is. And I think this is where leaders going forward will need a lot of support at the top, because for a lot of people, letting go is one of the hardest things to do.
What would be a good mental framework, if I could put it that way, to allow people to get used to that idea of letting go?
I think from what I've read in books and what we talk about in our book as well, is when everybody needs to move into that mindset of allowing collaboration to happen naturally. So is it that when a big meeting or a big project is becoming available, is it giving that curiosity space to your team? So a leader in a team could say, previously, we've had senior management meetings and then we've discussed on the table what can happen. But if we allow our teams to participate in that decision-making process and perhaps introduce it as a curiosity project and say, this is what we want to achieve. Now I'm going to allow you to go away and think about how we achieve that. So it's a process of saying to your people, I trust you, I respect your judgment, and I'm allowing you to have some free rein. My husband was in the military in the UK for almost 20 years, and we were talking about this very topic the other day. When an officer would give what they call mission command, they would have their non-commissioned officers such as sergeants and corporals around them who were the rest of the team. So in effect, the officer is the CEO. He would deliver to his group what he wanted to achieve as an outcome. So it might be getting from destination A to destination B through enemy territory. But he gave it to the corporals and the sergeants to talk amongst the team to say, hear from each person, well, how do you think we're going to do this? There's this enemy line of fire over here. There's this group of trees here that could be used. So it was allowing others to take part in the process of how they got from A to B safely and effectively, and then it would be reported back to the commanding officer. So it's the same in the military as it is in business, but it was giving the team an opportunity to speak and be trusted and respected for having their opinions heard, and then the outcome achieved.
I wonder if you've had much experience in dealing with situations where perhaps there is a level of collaboration and cooperation within an organization, but then you perhaps have a change in leadership. A new CEO comes on, and by and large, he seems okay with most things, but perhaps there are a few players that are a bit more, should I say, zealous. They take more initiative and they get things done that kind of, from the CEO's perspective, outshines him or her. And they feel threatened by the actions of such individuals. How, and I'm asking this from a team player's point of view, how would you tweak your actions and communication in order to allow for that change, but still the progress that you want to see within the organization?
So if I was a team member and say I was that overzealous person, or if I just take the role of a coach for that overzealous person, maybe not a coach, a mentor. Because as a coach, I wouldn't be advising, in my role.
Yeah.
But if I were an observer and were to provide feedback, I would potentially advise to go and have a conversation one-on-one with the new CEO and say, these are my ideas, these are my thoughts. Are you comfortable with me presenting it in the larger forum? Or would you like me to come to you with these ideas first? And then we can take them together to the larger forum. But the idea is to kind of circle back and ensure that the CEO realizes that it's an idea, it's a brilliant idea, it's coming from a person who's been with the company, who knows the culture, who knows the business, who knows the clients. And there's a way to take advantage of that versus feel threatened about it. So there's always, you've got to, this whole thing with trust building is all about having conversations and all about ensuring that the person sitting across from you knows that you're coming in without an agenda, and you're coming, or if you're coming in with an agenda, knows what that agenda is, right?
Mm-hmm.
My agenda is for the company to succeed. You and I are on the same page. So let's make sure that happens. So that's when all of those pretenses drop. That's when all of those fears drop, and you can genuinely start getting the best out of everyone who works for you.
So how do we keep it real, both from a leadership perspective as well as for team players who really, at least in some of the organizations I've worked in, quite tired of all the fluff and airy-fairy stuff that we often are fed, and would rather just have people say, give it to us straight.
Gail, would you like to take this?
That's
this has your 3 Ps in there too.
It does. That's a really interesting question, but I think in reality, do people really just want to be told anymore? I think that they want to, from what I have seen and what I've read about a lot through this pandemic particularly, is people want to be seen and heard. They want to be valued more in an organization. They don't want to just get on with and be told from the top.
Yeah.
Because what they're realizing in organizations where people are given the benefit of being heard and having a voice and developing their own emotional intelligence and being aware of others as well, is that they want to participate more and they want to be part of something that is really great. Mm-hmm. I think the whole idea of work has changed so much that to build that loyalty that Kavita was talking about before, when people are engaged and they're feeling empowered and they feel heard in an organization, they want to participate, they want to give back, and they want to continue helping to build that organization. So if they're just left to be told by their leaders just to get on with it, and maybe not having some of the fluffy stuff, but it doesn't have to be fluffy stuff, is, I think, the best way forward for organizations today is just to keep these conversations happening, keep the momentum building, and engender this entire sense of, the more that we speak about what's going on in the business, the more that we allow everybody to be heard, and the more that we collaborate on everything, the more that we can get better results happening. The people are going to, you may not see the changing levels of absenteeism and also people changing careers so frequently, because they want to be, that they feel that sense of belonging every day that they go to work, and they're able to participate and bring themselves fully out into the open. And so they're growing and building as people, and they want to stay. They want to keep adding value to their own lives as well as the organization as well. So I firmly believe that the organizations that can develop a really strong coaching culture and cultivate these curious conversations, there's lots of C words in there, not the P words you were mentioning, Kavita, but by having these curious conversations, by collaborating and having such open and progressive conversation, communication with their teams, I think this is the way to keep everybody together and to keep building such a strong sense of community going forward.
And Kavita, do you want to highlight some of those P words you were talking about?
And I said that because when we wrote this chapter, Gail had this concept of the 3 Ps.
I know.
That work towards keeping it real, and they are perfectionism, procrastination, and performance. And the idea was to talk about how one influences the other and eventually plays out into the third. So those are the 3 P words, and it's written very well in the book. So that I'll leave to you to read. But the idea, again, is when you keep it real, you've got to realize not only you've got to pay attention to, as a leader, what you are projecting about your needs, say of perfectionism, onto your team, and how you may potentially be setting them up for failure, because you're a perfectionist. When something comes to you that doesn't quite meet your standards, you're automatically shutting down the communication. But for the team player who is trying to play to your perfectionist needs, it's a moving goalpost, because unless they're completely in sync with you, they're never really going to understand what your need is. So again, it's about having those deeper conversations. It's about being clear, and it's about being aware of your traits and how those may be playing out. They may be good traits for sure, because at the end of the day, perfectionism is a good trait, and you look at it because it pushes you to be your best. But it can lead to things like procrastination and focus on some of those slightly negative aspects of not meeting deadlines and panicking and increasing stress towards the end, and so on and so forth. So it's about balancing it out. Okay. And again, keeping it real.
Again, it brings me back to this thought that really within an organization, if the culture is not very well established, then when something like a pandemic comes along, if the culture is not really set and the values not set, then you're really in a bit of hot water, if I'm not mistaken. And yes, it starts with the leadership, but there is also the need for the rest of the organization to really buy into that culture and values. That'd be right.
That's a very interesting point, and it can be looked at both ways. If there isn't a culture, then you can pick from the best and go the way you want to go.
Yeah.
And of course, there's that initial panic of what is the best? We've never done this before. How do we do it? So as long as at a time like this, senior leadership is agile, the company will succeed. But if at a time like this, senior leadership gets stuck, that's when the entire company will suffer.
But I think so many organizations were not prepared. So they may have had those, as Kavita said, the second part there, the ones who are not agile. So perhaps before the pandemic, they weren't even in that place either. And so their teams were perhaps going through the siloed approach. They weren't working collaboratively, the communication, there wasn't realistic expectations set. And so by being confronted by something as dramatic as the COVID crisis, it was like a rabbit in the headlights. What do we do now? Where do we go? How do we manage our teams? And then suddenly teams were thrust into the remote working scenario. And that was also for leaders who were used to having their people around them all the time. They were feeling very like a fish out of water. What do I do? How do I hold on to these people? How do I communicate with them? How do I know what they're actually doing at home? Are they being productive? Are we getting the results still? It was a very scary time for some organizations, whereas others who were agile, they have thrived.
Agility is certainly key. What about investing in this effort to keep things real? Realizing that people have their own, or each individual has their own ambitions, and therefore they need to be supported in their respective journeys. Is that part of the keeping it real and being empathetic conversation that we should be having as leaders?
I would say definitely, and with boundaries. You've got to, like, if someone is in a company and is doing a job as a project manager, but wants to be a musician on the outside, and that's their real goal, the leader needs to jump in there and help them be a good project manager and keep it real, as in understand boundaries as far as, okay, on the weekends, he's not going to be available because he's got gigs that he's performing or because he's got band practice or whatever that boils down to. But then the other aspect of boundaries is it needs to be the other way around as well. The team member can't expect the leader to say that or be okay with the fact that he may not be available one evening to work a little bit overtime because a project is due. So it's got to go both ways. And that's the aspect about, okay, fine, you help someone, but you've got to do it in the context of work and not be taken advantage of, because that happens very often too.
There's been a lot of conversation around mental health with the rise of the pandemic. In terms of keeping it real, is that something that's weaved into your everyday conversations, or is that almost something that requires a bit of a checklist that we go through to make sure everything is A-okay by and large?
Go for it, Gail.
Okay, I was just going to say, one of the things that I have read a lot about and seen within organisations that we've worked with and with our women's leadership program that Kavita and I both run, is when we ask the question, how are you? Leaders who are being very mindful of the mental health and the whole well-being aspect, and they are prioritising it for themselves, are actually asking, how are you really? So this is taking that question to the next level to really understand what are those things that are going on in somebody's life, especially with remote working. So you don't have those water cooler moments where somebody you might just stop and have a chat to one of the members in your team. Now, they've been thrust into a very unrealistic situation, and we talk about this in the book, where people are impacted by being at home in this boundaryless lifestyle, perhaps of children being homeschooled, partners also working, bandwidth. There's all of these things that have been going on. So when a leader checks in with a staff member and talks to them and says, how are things going? If you fail to ask that, how are you really, you're not going to get the full picture. But then that also isn't something that a leader can just ask if they haven't built that culture of care and that real depth of understanding with their team previous to COVID. So what were the extent of those water cooler conversations that you had with your team? The best leaders are the ones who just tap in and will be walking around on the floor of their organizations, and they get to know the people in their organizations. I've read several stories, case studies of those leaders who they know that there's a child being born in 6 months' time and that somebody's just won an award at a school or something like that, but they really tap in and they get to know. And I'm sure these are the organizations as well. If that's the CEO, this is filtered down through their leadership teams. And so through this crisis, I'm hoping that these people have still been felt like they've been really cared for. So it's just interesting by asking that one extra word at the end of a sentence that you can engage and understand and be there for your teams. But it is something that has to be built in. It's not an automatic addition to a question if you haven't set a plan in action before. You need to learn how to ask that and build that within your team.
Sorry, Kavita, did you have something to add to that?
Absolutely. This whole concept of mental well-being, and you said mental wellness has suffered a lot. Well-being to Gail is very different than well-being to me, which is very different than well-being to you, Vinay. I know Gail's idea of well-being is to go on a power walk, even at 7 o'clock in the evening, and she would happily walk a good 10 kilometers before she came home. That to me would not be well-being. So again, the idea is that you need to be able to have these conversations to even understand what well-being is to each and every one of your team members, so that you can support it based on how they need you to support it. Okay. So again, this is talking about that mental well-being and paying attention and ensuring that, as Gail mentioned, every team member is heard. There are other aspects of mental illness that have bubbled to the surface because of the pandemic. So with things like that, I have a client who I worked with last year through the toughest times of the pandemic, and I coached her. The company had bought an entire package of 6 sessions, and we were working through a 6-month process. And somewhere in between, I noticed that there was a deeper need for her. So I took not our conversations, but I took my concern back to senior leadership in her company, because she was pretty senior as well. And I said, listen, of course, after talking to my client, but the client needed a therapist, because other aspects of mental illness started coming up in our coaching sessions. And that's an area that I don't jump into at all, because I am not an expert by any means. So through that, we got her to work with a therapist, and then coaching and therapy worked very well together. So one week she would coach, the next week she would go in for therapy. The next session she had with me, which was about a month later, she would come back into coaching, and we piggyback off of each other, the therapist and I. But again, through what our client needed. So that is one thing to pay attention to as well, right? That the leader, now again, this can potentially cause areas of concern, because an employee may open up to a coach, but they may not necessarily open up to the leader in that sense. But somewhere, when I circled back to her leader, he knew there was something there. So once he knew it, he knew how to support her. Now, he had a very parental leadership style. So he was very involved in her day-to-day, and he was aware that there were certain shortfalls and certain things that she just couldn't do, but he didn't know why. So we thought coaching would help. We started in there, then we realized it was actually a much deeper issue. So there was therapy that was needed there, and then working together, eventually it all worked out, and it is a success story. But the idea is that people need to know and realize that this is something that they have to address.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. The 8th pillar, I believe, is constantly learn. How would you suggest we approach that one?
It's probably our favorite topic, isn't it?
Yes.
We're both.
Yeah,
exactly. We're both insatiable and voracious learners. Both of us from our childhoods, and we address this in the book as well. We have always been curious people since we were very small people, about life, about learning. And I think becoming coaches and having the only way to become a better coach and to be able to be of the greatest benefit to yourself and your clients is to continually upskill yourself. And so we put that as a key pillar, because it's not just for us as coaches, it's for people in life. When you can get curious and see whatever it is that you're doing as an adventure, on that adventure, you want to learn new things about yourself. You want to learn new ways of doing things. And so the only way of doing that is surrounding yourself with opportunities to gain knowledge, to have conversations with people, to hear different people's perspectives, to listen to podcasts, read books, watch YouTube videos, experience it yourself. So for us, this whole idea of continuing to nourish your mind and your body and yourself with this continual learning and feeding it is probably, I guess it's almost like a positive drug. It is something that continues to build you. It empowers you. It makes you feel that you can achieve more for yourself, and you can then share that and help others and elevate them toward their success, because you're tapping into just different ways of thinking. Kavita and I will often start reading a book and we will share it with each other and go, this could really help with this, and we can maybe bring elements of it into our upcoming leadership programs that we run. Or we will watch something and just go, there might be one line in it that you capture, and it opens up so much thinking. But it keeps you on your toes. You can hear in my voice, I'm very passionate about talking about why it's such an important part of being. It's a wondrous state to be in, and it really just feeds my continual lust for curiosity in my life.
Is there a way in which you structure your learning, as opposed to the temptation is to take in everything that you would think is of interest or useful to you, and that can be quite overwhelming at times. How do you set up filters to determine what is useful and what is not so useful at the current time?
From my perspective, I think it's when I think I use so much of the knowledge to gain as a coach. So I want to be the best coach I can be for my clients. So it may be because I specifically work around mindset and peak personal performance, I'm very driven toward finding out different techniques and tools I can use that meet those criteria in my business. So if I'm looking to continually upskill my mindset techniques, and I will look at learning from a psychology perspective, and I will, like I said, for my filter, I will find myself down routes of those people that inspire me, either through books that I will read or videos that I will watch. Equally to do with performance, it's the same. So I do keep quite a tight, but still a curious approach to gaining that knowledge from certain areas. I don't think I've nailed it specifically to have an agenda of how I follow it, but I just find myself honing in on those two key aspects of my coaching to be able to add more to my toolbox. Kavita?
Yeah, for me, thanks, Gail. What I do is I set aside time to be able to research or delve deeper, or anytime I find really nice articles that I want to read or nice research papers, I have a running list of what to read next, how to read. So I know I'll get to it, and somewhere at the back of my mind, I have, it doesn't jump out at me constantly saying, oh my God, have you read this article? Oh my God, have you read that? Because as soon as I've seen it, I've written it down, and then I know I get back to it. Or if I see it online, I save the link, and then I always get back to it. As far as organizing goes, that's how I've been doing it. Otherwise, I think Gail and I both would consider ourselves magpies. We jump towards anything that interests and that shines, or that gives us that bling in our work. Or for me, it's psychology and it's new terms that come out, and I'm just constantly attracted towards them. But again, the idea is, and I call this a wanna-do list. I always have a wanna-do list running, and it has things on there from wanting to learn how to play a guitar all the way to the articles I want to read, the books I want to read. And I just use that as a tool for organization.
Is there an aspect of learning that most people are not conscious of that you feel is important to highlight?
One thing that actually jumps to mind is this. So maybe it's a little bit cultural, right? But having grown up in India, I went through a very straightforward way of gaining education. So went through school, secondary school, high school, went straight into university, got my undergraduate degree, went straight in for an MBA program, got my master's degree. And somewhere, because of all of that, I was like, okay, now I've got it all. Now I just need to work. So it can turn into a fixed mindset. So after all of that, I remember when I was working through my job and through the company, there were numerous certifications that came my way because that was just part of what the company did for us as internal coaches. But when I stepped out of that world, this whole concept then for again having to invest and pay for getting my coaching certification or getting certified by an outside body, initially it was a little bit like, do I really need to do it? And then I was like, hold on a second, what kind of a question is that? So I asked myself that question. I was like, of course, this is what needs to happen. But the problem is that people may think that if they have all the degrees against their name, that they have done learning. And that could be a subconscious bias that I'm trying to get to with this entire story behind it. But that's not, and it's not that you have to go out and get a degree to actually feel that you have learned something. You could very well be out on a walk and just see how a bird is building a different nest and learn something new about it. Or as a walk down my street the other day where I saw a python, wonder why a python is coming down a tree instead of just staying on the where the bird's eggs are. So all those things are aspects of learning, and we often forget that there's learnings in everyday simplistic life. You don't necessarily have to have a degree stamped across your name just because you've learned how a python eats. So yeah, that's just one realization that people might not pay attention to, or might have forgotten, or might not even know exists.
That's excellent. But should we also be looking to apply our learning in order to reinforce it, as opposed to a mental note that you file away the back of your head that could potentially be forgotten?
Always. And that was my thesis when I did my master's. It was the
Okay.
transfer of learning. Absolutely. You can measure the transfer of learning as I did in my paper, which was never published. But the idea is that when you want to reinforce it, find different ways to do that. Either come back and blog about it or talk to someone about it. And then you're not only reinforcing your learning, you can use it as a story, as I am today, and help other people understand it, because some people are visual learners. I use a lot of storytelling when I'm mentoring or when I'm consulting, because it just, people relate to stories a lot better than they would to data.
Yeah, there's a lot that we could walk away with from all of this. To wrap things up, given that you've now published your book, and it's been some time since the pandemic as well, and we're hopefully making progress out of it, would you say that the 8 pillars are sufficient, or are there any other pillars that you would consider adding to your existing framework?
I would say that the 8 pillars are a really good start. And then from there, you build on it. Gail?
Yeah, I agree with you, Kavita. I think the whole idea of our leadership pillars has probably one before it, which is a key part of the work that Kavita and I do. And it's a unique part of our business, which is that self-leadership. So this has to actually come before all of these 8 pillars, but it then gets interwoven into the 8. So we have discovered that because we're running one at the moment, a women's mastermind program on self-leadership, and we are just about to embark on 2 further projects here in Malaysia. It is this idea of self-leadership to enable people to get into the position that they can become better, and as we call them, C19 leaders. So by going back to, or not to the drawing board, but taking a step back and a pause for a moment to say, what does my own style of leadership look like? Who am I? What makes me tick? What are some of the behaviors and traits that I'm holding on to that are not serving me to become the best leader that I can be? And so how can I learn to become the best self-leader for myself first, so I can look at all of those selves, such as confidence, self-worth, imposter syndrome, to name a few, and then moving into that area to say, okay, when I am practicing and building and continuing to learn about myself, and I'm learning to master those habits, then I can transition effectively into a full C19 leadership program to then tap into and continue to grow. So it's about sustaining the habits that we're building, and then we're not saying we're building this ideal, this perfect leader that's out there, that the C19 leader is the only model out there, but we have built a very holistic leadership model that is achievable, and it's a growth tool, and growth never stops learning.
Excellent. I'll ask you both this question, and the question is, if you were listening to these 2 episodes, what would be your top takeaway?
Mine would be that, firstly, it's a very good question. Thank you. Because as you can see, it stumped both. Mine would be that leadership needs to evolve and change with the times. And if nothing else, this pandemic has brought to the forefront that transactional leadership needs to change into a style of relational leadership.
Okay, excellent.
So mine is approach your leadership journey with curiosity. It's about getting out there. It's about saying, I want to see this as an adventure. I want to become who I'm going to become. I want to learn along the way. I want to surround myself with those who will help me to grow and to be able to sustain that growth so that I can lead myself well and I can lead others and be part of something even bigger than just myself.
Brilliant. For listeners who are curious and would like to find out more or to connect with both of you, where would you recommend they head to?
Okay, so I've got my website. I'll share my details first, and
Sure.
then we do have collaborative sites as well. So we have, my website is gailmgibson.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn, Gail Gibson. I also have a podcast myself that I run, a weekly podcast called The Can Do Way, and that's available on Spotify and various other platforms across the podcast world.
So my website is innersensecoaching.com, and I am on LinkedIn and on Instagram. And on LinkedIn, I can be found under Kavita Satwalekar, and on Instagram, it's Kavita_your_best_life.
Okay, and your collaborative site?
Our collaborative is a women's leadership group that we have on LinkedIn. So it's called WLN, the Women Leaders Network Global. And this is an online platform that we created and we launched in the middle of the pandemic last year. And we've been running our networking group with women across the world since that time, and just connecting, collaborating and having those conversations with an incredible group of women leaders who've joined our tribe. And we're just building this brand around the C19 leadership. It's shortly to be trademarked as well, which is a very exciting part of our journey. And we're embarking on our quest to get C19 self-leadership out there as well. We've got our own brand of self-leadership, and that will be our next book. Perhaps in the next 12 months at some stage, we will write that.
Excellent. Look forward to it. Thank you both very much. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Vinay. I loved the questions you've asked us and really got us thinking as well about why we wrote the book and why the leadership that we're talking about matters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vinay. This has been a fabulous few hours of my life. I have really enjoyed the questions, the conversations, the laughs, and you have stumped us quite a few times. So yes. I really love that about it. Thank you.